Stephen Joyce would have 10 minutes should he wish to take it.
Mr. Speaker, last year the world was gripped with the global financial crisis, and it's quite easy in the New Zealand context to forget that, while the rest of the world copes with some of the toughest financial conditions still and the aftershocks of that crisis. In fact, in Europe now we have countries like Greece and Ireland that are still grappling with the effects of the global financial crisis. Last year, this government worked hard to mitigate the worst effects of the global financial crisis in the New Zealand environment. And with the help of our friends across the Tasman and the Asian countries, we were able to prevent the worst of the recession coming home to this country, to the point where most New Zealanders are now of the view that the global financial crisis wasn't too bad. But across the rest of the world, of course, it was very harsh indeed. So this year we have a different set of challenges. This year we have different decisions to make. And the decisions that the Prime Minister's statement alluded for all New Zealanders this year are we actually going to take some decisions to enhance growth for the benefit of New Zealand families in 2010? Are we going to deal with the tax issues that this country has that discourage savings and growth and result in exporting some of our most skilled labour overseas? Are we going to take reasonable steps to advance some industries that can add growth and wealth to New Zealand and New Zealand families, like the mineral sector and the aquaculture sector, to name just two? Are we going to take reasonable steps to control state sector spending, to stop the state sector crowding out the private sector, and to improve productivity in the state sector, which has lagged the private sector and productivity growth in this country? And of course, productivity is a huge part of creating growth and wealth. Are we going to invest in infrastructure? Are we going to give ourselves the ability to do more in the infrastructure space? Are we going to tackle the skills shortage that has bedevilled this country for a long period of time? Are we going to tackle the 20% underachievement that we have with school children leaving school unable to have suitable levels of literacy and numeracy? These are the questions that we have in front of us, and some of the answers are not easy. Some of them are a little discomforting at times, some of them are a little challenging, but they do need to be made. And that is the challenge the Prime Minister has laid down before us all this year in his statement to Parliament. Are we going to take the changes to encourage economic growth and prosperity for New Zealand families? Labor didn't take those chances. They didn't meet those challenges. They didn't make the decisions. In their 9 years in government, they spent a lot of time calling for reports and then not acting on them. They had lots of reports. They had the knowledge wave, they had the growth and innovation framework, they had things like their skills strategy, they had even a small business advisory group which they got together and asked them to come up with a whole range of things and then ignored most of them. And what happened? And then their other solution was to not make any hard decisions around public spending. They layered spending program on top of spending program. If a program wasn't working, they wouldn't stop it. They would actually just add another one. And when somebody said, why don't you stop the first one, they say, well, that might upset a few people. So they just kept laying program on top of program, and this government is left with trying to unpick some of the mess they left. And if they did try and do something for growth and they encountered any opposition, then they'd throw more money at the problem. That was their solution. And I personally, of course, are very familiar with that around a certain roading project in Auckland, which came up with a highly expensive $2.8 billion option because the government wasn't prepared to discuss with the community and come up with a sensible mitigation proposal that didn't place the country further in hock. So they had the government sector growing hugely, they had the private sector growing anemically, and the tradable sector went backwards for 5 years. As a result, we were the first country in the world to go into recession in 2008, before the global financial crisis. And there is no coincidence that we've come out of it better with a new national government rather than the old Labor government. And they still don't understand what's required. They still believe in the fiscal fairies at the bottom of the garden. They oppose every change in spending priorities this government has put forward. They have called for more public spending all the time. They have called us to legislate for higher wages. Now, that is true economic illiteracy to suggest you can legislate for higher wages when the wages are paid for by people who actually get out and do the entrepreneurship and they pay what they can afford. You cannot legislate for a wealthier economy. And it's time the Labor Party worked that out, because if they don't, they will remain an economic joke. They have opposed all significant changes in regulation and some of the insignificant ones. And I note that the chainsaw of trees has not yet occurred in Auckland. There are still a few trees still up in that proud city, apparently only a couple, but they are all still there, and that Armageddon of trees did not come to pass in that city. But the nadir of their economic understanding came with a little committee last year to try and tie down the New Zealand exchange rate. And the grand irony of that, they just didn't understand, because the one big contribution government makes to high exchange rates is high levels of public spending, which lead to high interest rates, which contribute to high exchange rates. So there they were, all sitting in a room saying, we want to get exchange rates down, but we don't want to talk about the rather large elephant in the middle, which is how much we grew public spending over the last 9 years. So, Mr. Speaker, I think New Zealanders are ready for change. I think New Zealanders are ready to step out for that brighter future. They are ready to make those decisions that 9 years of Labor didn't make, and this year we are going to make them, and the Prime Minister's statement lays it out very carefully and sensibly indeed. And one of the most important, which I'd like to focus on for a couple of minutes, Mr. Speaker, is tax. Why is tax so important? Because tax is the one thing where government is pervasive in people's lives. Like it or hate it, it's death and taxes, isn't it? The government fortunately doesn't control death, but they certainly control taxes. And that is the one thing the government have the greatest impact on the economic outcomes. It is tax that determines the incentives for New Zealand families. The greater the tax burden on a particular part of life, the less people do it. The less of the tax burden, the more people will do it. So in New Zealand, what do? Well, currently we tax labour at a high rate. We tax people's personal work at a high rate. We tax savings and investment at the same high rate. We tax consumption comparatively at a lower rate, and we tax investment property negatively. Now, as I said, people respond to incentives. So is it any wonder that this country over-invests in property, over-consumes relative to their incomes, doesn't save enough, and a huge swag of our skilled people and their families take themselves off to Australia, which was incidentally Labor's skills strategy, of course. People respond to incentives, and if you want to lower consumption, stop people over-investing in property, reward people better for their labour so they stay and labour here, and reward people for savings and interest, you have to make the adjustments to the tax rate. And until the Labor Party works that out, they will not know how to grow an economy. That's the reality of it. And it is time they learnt, because we couldn't afford another 9 years of their economic mismanagement than we have had in the last 9 years. So we need to deal with taxes. We need to get a much more productive public sector, and we are working very, very hard on that. We need to encourage innovation, and the Prime Minister has laid out some challenges in the areas of science, research and technology. And it also has to be said, in the trade area, we are working very hard. We have our two men about the world, Mr Grosser and Mr McCulley, who are out there working very, very hard on signing. We have trebled the efforts of the previous government in striving to achieve free trade agreements. We're also reforming regulation. We're driving reform in the regulation area to allow more things to be done, and of course we are doing huge things in infrastructure. And modesty prevents me going on at great length about the transport sector and the communications sector, but of course we are flat out, and of course we're putting a lot of work in the rail sector as well. Finally, education is crucially important. And the irony of it is that Labor, supposedly the education party, supposedly, of course nobody believes that except Labor and the union mates, supposedly the education party have been arguing against tackling the shameful tale of underachievement that comes out of our school sector, and they have been afraid